Chapter 12. The Family Scatters. The factional violence had to be brought under control. In September 1967, Chairman Mao visited Hunan and other provinces, and, disturbed by what he found, issued calls for an end to the fighting, a return of all students to their schools, the surrender of weapons to the army, and above all, unity. Each province was exhorted to strengthen the preparatory revolutionary committee he had ordered formed in August, to be made up of representatives from all the factions. This was to provide the structure for post-Cultural Revolution government. Of course, there was a great distance between the edicts and their realization, for the factions were not about to forget their differences so easily. People recognized that in the so-called Great Alliance, the real power holders would be the army, and the army was not popular because of its conservative bent. A propaganda campaign was launched to improve relations between the army and the masses, with slogans like "The people support the army loves the people." In Hunan, it wasn't until April 1968 that the Revolutionary Committee proper was actually formed. But by the previous October, the Preparatory Revolutionary Committee had made a good beginning. Its stated purpose was to struggle, criticize, and change, that is, to attack the capitalist rulers in each unit and reform the old government structure. In this way, the Cultural Revolution was supposed to be turned back to its original targets. All cadres with problems, like father, were to have an opportunity to attend a Chairman Mao thought study class at the old party school across the river. They could remold their thought while a thorough investigation of their cases was being made. Then a final judgment would be passed, and they would perhaps be liberated if their failings were judged not serious. The cadres were to go in groups according to what system their units belonged to. Finance and trade were together. The artistic and cultural troops, industry and transportation, education, and so on. Of course, there would be overlap since not everyone would be released at once. Father was to go in the 9th wave, made up of members of units controlled directly by the old Hunan Party Committee, such as the newspaper, the radio station, the Hunan Publishing House, the Minority Nationalities Religions Committee, and the Hunan People's Committee. Father was overjoyed when he heard about this plan, for he was still convinced that he had committed no serious crime and was the victim of a misunderstanding. He saw it as a chance to settle things once and for all, to resolve this confusing series of events, to learn what his future would be. It would be quiet as the study class, and he would be protected from the abuses of society. He would have a place to study the works of Chairman Mao in peace. Of course, he wasn't happy to leave us, for the few months of family life we had had together since the girls had returned to their schools had meant a lot to him. Not having to lose sleep over Liang was a great comfort. He wasn't happy that his residence card would be transferred to the study class and his rice coupons issued there either, for it was a bit frightening to be separated from his beloved Hunan Daily, where he had spent more than half his life. Still, he never thought of the separation as final. He would surely be given work to do again later. So when it was time for the 9th group to go, Father was ready in a few hours. His bedding folded up neatly like a soldier's, his tin cup and towel, toothbrush, toothpaste, and soap all he needed for his indefinite stay. That morning, Father went and knocked on the Peng family's door, and Peng Ming's father came out, all ready to go too. Peng Ming's mother and sister came along, all of us marching to the basketball court behind the two men, looking a bit bedraggled, sad to say goodbye, but happy that our relatives were being given a second chance. We were a bit early, but already there was a large group gathered in front of a notice that assigned the cadres to different groups on a military model. The whole group was to make up a company, but below that there were platoons, and below that squadrons of 7 or 8. A rebel worker was to supervise each squadron, and a number of military officers would be in charge of the platoons and the company. Soon, about 10 Green Army trucks arrived, and the cadres were told to line themselves up and stand at attention. There were more than 100 of them, journalists, editors, photographers from all of Hunan province. Each one had a Chairman Mao button on his chest and a little red book in his hand. Each one carried a square green bundle on his back. A tall, thick army officer walked back and forth in front of them, looking them over. Suddenly, he cried out, in a northern accent, "Right face!" The poor intellectuals did not know what to do. Many of them looked about in confusion, while others shuffled vaguely towards the right. Father turned left. I roared with laughter, but at the same time I couldn't believe Father could be so stupid. I knew more about discipline than he did. The commander said, "All right. What would you do if there were a war, not knowing left from right? When you've graduated, you'll be real soldiers, every one of you. Now let's recite Chairman Mao's most recent announcement together." So they recited, in a strong, proud voice, the statement saying that they were going to struggle against themselves and criticize revisionism. Then they were asked to sing The Great Helmsman, and someone pushed Father forward to conduct, as he had in the old days before the Cultural Revolutions. His back was a little bent, and his short revolutionary haircut had none of the looks of his carefully styled editor's cut. But there was spirit left in the way he moved with the music, and his arms still held command and confidence. The loyalty dance was next, and we all danced, the soldiers too. Hundreds of people on the small basketball court, using simple movements to express our love for Chairman Mao. I felt submerged in the happiness of the group, in the pleasure of the mass action. There was one small group that was not so happy, though, for they were not allowed to participate, but stood on the side under guard. There were the capitalist roaders, including senior assistant editor Meng. When Father and the others piled into the trucks, making a splendid picture in their dark clothing dotted here and there with military green, standing behind the pictures of Chairman Mao and the huge red flags, the capitalist roaders were ushered into cars and driven away. We 3 children wept a little as we watched Father go. Now there was really no one to care for us, and we had no way of knowing when we could see Father again. Liang had been taking Mother's role for a long time, and now she would have to take the part of Father as well. On the first Saturday afternoon, I went to the gate to wait for Father, because everyone said that those whose questions were not so serious would be allowed to come home on weekends. Liang Fang and Liang Weiping stayed behind to cook a splendid meal, not something from the dining hall, but a real dinner, with the new spring vegetables the peasants were bringing in, and fat pork and steaming rice. There were many at the gate beside myself, talking among themselves, convincing themselves that their fathers, mothers, husbands, wives, sons, and daughters would surely be coming home. Almost all of us were disappointed. 7 or 8 cadres showed up in a group, and their rejoicing families swept them away. The rest of us waited for nearly an hour before we gave up. That night, the 3 of us cried, leaving the beautiful meal sitting there on the table untouched. We couldn't understand what was wrong and why he hadn't come home. It was the same every week, but it got worse. For now the cadres were coming back in groups of 20 and 30, and then 40 and 50. The families could no longer bear to wait at the gateway, but walked all the way down to the river and stood at the dock waiting for the ferry, stepping right next to the edge where the cold and wind blew off the water, picking their relatives out at a great distance among the peasants with their baskets of vegetables and the commuters with their bicycles. Even after the group of cadres got off and we knew Father wasn't coming, we always waited for the next boat and then walked home in silence, not even bothering to pretend we weren't miserable. Finally, one day we got some news, although it wasn't worth much. The worker in charge of Father's squadron came by our house on Sunday and gave us 24 yuan, which he told us we could be receiving every month. He was nasty to us, telling us that Father was very busy and had no time to come home. He would say nothing about his situation or when we might expect him. In a way, this made us feel even worse. Even that little home I had left was about to be destroyed. I had lost my mother through a political movement. I had lost my father through a political movement. And now I was to lose my two sisters. This time, it was the movement to send educated youths to the countryside to live and work with the peasants. The Cultural Revolution at this stage had turned inside out. Where at first the students had gone to the factories to spread revolution, now the workers' Chairman Mao thought propaganda teams had moved to take over the schools. According to Chairman Mao's directives, they were to seize power on the educational front and supervise the intellectuals, and as it turned out, they stayed there until Chairman Mao's dying day. One of their main tasks was to put into effect Chairman Mao's call for lower and upper middle school graduates to go up to the mountains and down to the countryside. They delivered mobilizing reports saying that the peasants were waiting for the students warmly, that in the countryside, fish could be scooped out of the flooded rice fields with a hat, and wild turkeys were so numerous that they could be killed with a stick. They said it was the students' duty to turn Chairman Mao's home province into a beautiful park, that this was a great opportunity to achieve revolutionary glory, that those who went would become the true red inheritors of the revolution, tempering themselves and building the revolutionary cause, just as Chairman Mao himself had led the Red Army to do in the Yannan region during the anti-Japanese war. Those who signed up early would be proving their loyalty to Chairman Mao, whereas those who hesitated would be considered politically backward. Middle school students from Changsha would be able to choose among 3 different districts, but if they prefer to make separate arrangements to join relatives in other places, that would also be acceptable and praiseworthy. The main thing was to go, to leave the crisis-ridden cities and begin a new life. The young people signed up excitedly for many reasons. Because the Cultural Revolution had exhausted them, because they wanted to escape from their unhappy lives at home, because there was nothing to do at school, because they yearned for something fresh and romantic, and above all, because Chairman Mao had told them to go. Later, after the first group sent back reports about what it was really like, nobody wanted to go anymore. But by then, the program was no longer voluntary, and there was no choice in the matter. In January 1968, Liang signed up to go to Jing County in the West Hunan, a rugged mountainous district that was the choice of many of the older and earlier Red Guards whose parents were under criticism and who wanted to get as far away as possible to avoid society's scorn. She had given up all hopes of figuring out the Cultural Revolution, for she had been right one day and wrong the next too many times. She regretted the violence and excesses to which she had contributed. Too late she saw the futility of such acts. But she hadn't lost her interest in social change and the nature of society. She thought that by going to the poorest area, she could really investigate China and learn something about Marxism, Leninism, and revolution. She truly believed she could help create a new countryside, a mechanized communist utopia. Liang Weiping chose the Yuanjiang district near Dongting Lake and Hubei province, for she wasn't sure that she could handle the tough life in western Hunan. She was among the first to sign up in her whole school, and she persuaded Peng Ming's sister and some other good friends to register with her. In their imaginations, they saw their country destinations as a lovely place, a sweet dream where they could amuse themselves. Neither of my sisters worried about the details of how they would live, for they weren't leaving much behind them. However, they did want to say goodbye to father. Liang Fang's group was scheduled to leave first, and the day before she was to go, she announced that she was crossing the river to see him. I heard this with great excitement and a little trepidation, for I longed terribly to see him myself, but I had never heard of anyone at the study class being allowed to have visitors. I begged Liang Fang to let me go too. I think she was glad of my company, as if she were clinging to the last bits of family she had left. Liang Weiping had an organizational meeting to attend and saw us off regretfully at the bus stop, thrusting two of father's shirts into our hands, newly mended. It felt strange to board the boat we had gone to meet so many times. I felt almost as if we were crossing a forbidden line. The ferry groaned and creaked, and the Xiang River seemed broad and fierce. Autumn having restored the fullness that summer baked away. Liang Fang and I stood close together, looking at the narrow junks with their patched square sails as they rocked and plunged over our muddy wake. Rongwan town had restored itself since I had last been there, and it was bustling with people doing their marketing. The narrow cobblestone street twisted among the old wooden houses until it straightened and broadened into a country road. It was about 4 li to the study class, but we didn't take a bus. For some reason, we wanted to avoid asking directions. We knew immediately that we had arrived when we saw a red brick compound laid out neatly and symmetrically at the foot of the Yuelu mountain with "Struggle Against Oneself, Criticize Revisionism," in white paint on the walls. We hesitated several minutes, afraid to approach the armed soldiers on duty at the gatehouse. But at last Liang Fang walked firmly up and said, "We've come to see our father." The soldier looked surprised, but he led us into the gatehouse, asking, "What's his company and squadron number?" Fortunately, we remembered, and he made a call reporting our arrival and asked us to wait a few minutes. From where we were standing, we could see a small sports ground on which a group of men were being drilled by a soldier. From the looks of them, they were intellectuals, for many wore glasses, but I didn't recognize any of them. They were running in place with great precision and an air of experience. At last, the phone rang, and we were told we could go into the office. Following the soldiers' directions, we walked past the dining hall where we saw several hundred tables set up in one huge room, bowls and chopsticks laid neatly at each place, and past the dormitories where through the windows we could see the cadres studying along the long tables between their bunks, smoking as they read. The whole place was perfectly silent. For a while, I couldn't figure out why things looked so nice. And then I realized that it was the perfect place I had been in more than a year, where there were no big character posters. However, on each dormitory there was what looked like a festive display, a series of big pictures of Chairman Mao, and below them vertical rows of bright red paper hearts. We went up to look at one of the displays and read the words, "Loyalty Board," and saw that each heart was labeled with someone's name, and beside it was a row of little red stars and flags. Then we understood that this was a record of each student's monthly performance, for the stars and flags corresponded to a long horizontal list of categories. 5 minutes oath of loyalty, early military exercises, personal hygiene, personal appearance, collective study of newspaper and documents, physical labor for thought reform, speaking during criticism meetings, self-criticisms, loyalty activities, memorization of quotations and works of Chairman Mao, singing revolutionary songs on entering the dining hall, evening oral reports to Chairman Mao on daily conduct, and so on. All the spaces were filled with either flags, good, or stars, excellent, so everyone must have been trying very hard. At last, we found the reception room for the Hunan Daily Company, where an arrogant-looking military man was waiting for us. He told us that father was very busy studying and could not be disturbed. We should go back home and father would come see us when he wasn't so busy. We argued with him for nearly half an hour, explaining that Liang Fang was going to the countryside and might not be back for years, that it had been months since we had seen father, that we had brought a few things for him. Finally, the man agreed to go get him, but the interview would have to be restricted to no more than 10 minutes. Father came in looking tired and thin, but his face lit up when he saw us, his eyes shining behind his glasses. Then Liang Fang explained all in a breath that she and Liang Weiping were going to the countryside, and father suddenly seemed wearier than I had ever seen him. This family will be scattered all over the place, he sighed. But the home of a revolutionary is the 4 Cs. His smile was bitter. I'm to blame for everything. I don't even have any money to give you, and now you're going so far from home with no one to look after you. Liang, he looked at my hand. What will you do now? You must promise me to stay at home and study. Suddenly he looked cheered and said, I think there are a few rice coupons tucked away in my copy of Das Kapital. Maybe that will help. We knew time was pressing and wanted to know so much. Why haven't you come home? I asked. Is your question serious? Father glanced nervously over at the soldier, who was occupying himself at the desk. Oh, no, I'm just very busy. I'm so sorry not to be with you now, but I want to use every minute to study. Maybe soon I'll come back on Sundays, and after that I'll graduate and can be at home all the time. I felt like crying because it was obvious that Father had been suffering a lot. He just didn't want to tell us, or couldn't tell us. Liang pressed the shirts Liang Weiping had mended for him into his hands. We thought you might be too busy to wash your shirts every day, so Liang Weiping fixed these for you. I'm sorry we couldn't bring... She broke off awkwardly, not wanting to reproach Father for our poverty. It seemed there was nothing to talk about that wasn't painful. Our time was already up, and the soldier interrupted us, but Father insisted on seeing us off and begged him to let him accompany us part of the way. The soldier finally left to consult with other leaders and returned with the worker in charge of Father's squadron, the nasty man who brought us our monthly 24 yuan. Father could go, they said, but this man was to walk a few feet behind us the whole way. Our footsteps spoke out what our voices could not, that the family ties of a lifetime were now about to be stretched to their outer limits. In these final moments together, we thought over everything the family should have been but was not, of all the happy futures we had envisaged that were now the shattered dreams of the past. Now Father was like a prisoner and Liang about to become a peasant. How unlike anything either of them had imagined for themselves. How Liang had wanted to go to college, how Father had wanted to join the party and go to the top of his profession. How I needed a family. The peasant houses tucked into their clusters of trees looked so protected and homelike, almost a mockery of what we needed so much but could not have. Father wanted to come right down onto the dock with us, but we urged him back, afraid that we might start to cry in front of all the other passengers. Father himself kept back the tears with a supreme effort. He knew his supervisor was watching him and that a lack of control might have unforeseen consequences. So he was the first to turn away, and we watched his close-cropped head, taller than the others in the crowd, until it dwindled and was lost in the distance. Liang left the next day, and Liang Weiping and I went to the number 1 middle school to see her off. She had almost nothing to take with her, just half a mosquito net and a body-worn old army-style jacket. The trucks were decorated with flowers and banners saying, "The farther from home, the nearer to Chairman Mao," and the poor and lower-middle peasants are closer relatives than mother and father. All the students were wearing huge red paper flowers on their chests, but Liang face was ashen and many of her classmates were weeping. As the motor started up, there was a roar of cymbals and drums and firecrackers, and the propaganda team led us all in shouting, "Learn from the educated youth. Salute the educated youth." Then the trucks pulled out on a farewell parade throughout the city. Liang was leaving Changsha for good. Liang Weiping's departure was scheduled for the following week. She went across the river to see Father in her turn, but her request was denied and she came home in tears. Her last days at home were spent cleaning everything one more time. She patched the windows where the cardboard had fallen out and darned all my clothes extra in the places they were likely to tear. She even scrubbed the walls and washed the floor, but the house looked just as barren when she was finished. Then she took down our framed family photographs. She polished the glass over and over again, and finally opened the bag and took out a little picture of the three of us with our 奶奶, me fat and frowning on a tricycle, Liang in overalls with brows in her hair and big white smile, 奶奶 hunched over, draped in black, staring at the camera with big eyes, Liang Weiping herself with her hair cut short because of the scalp disease, but looking plump and pretty. Liang Heng, she said, would you mind if I took this with me? I want to have something to remember the family by. At last she was gone. That evening I discovered she had left a note for Father saying, Father, I love you. I miss you. It wasn't until I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep that I realized how terribly, terribly lonely I was. Her ironic last words to me echoed in my ears. Oh well, maybe in the countryside they'll let me join the Communist Youth League. The difficulty